echo, so the audio was missing in the earlier part. Okay. Fortunately, we haven't really gone through a lot of stuff yet. So when you click on media, you have all of these options, and in your case, I think you want to use either video player or just player itself. So let's say you're doing a video player. We click on this box here, scroll down, and click on more information. And we go to media components, and we're looking at video player. So there we go. You have 3GPP or MPEG-4, as containers. Now I'm not really sure about the codec, but apparently whatever Android supports, it will just pass it through. So if you click on this link here, it will tell you exactly what type of a core media format it supports. Is that okay? Does that answer your question?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. All right. But I'm just lazy. I just need to put a picture here. But if you want it to be fancy, you can include a video of some kind. You can even put a web component here, a web viewer component. So this way, it points to a certain URL. Then you can change what you want people to see on a daily basis, because you can change the URL, the content at the URL address. So then you can change it on a daily basis. Okay, today I feel like putting this up. Tomorrow I feel like putting that up onto the internet. Okay, so it's entirely up to you. Okay, if you want to do a splash screen, there are lots and lots of flexibility. Is that okay? All right. Okay. So, but the focus is not on the user design. My focus is always on the logic of the application. So this time, I want to look at this checkbox here and the start button, and I want to say, okay, but how do we remember the state of the checkbox here, so that this way, I can automatically skip the splash screen if the user does not want to see the splash screen every single time. So to do that, I have to use TinyDB or some kind of storage. Okay, you can use TinyDB. You can also use the experimental feature, which is Firebase DB. But Firebase DB requires internet connectivity. So that may or may not be what you want to do, to do something like that simple. So I'm going to use TinyDB because this should really just be specific to this installation. So I would use TinyDB, which is under storage. Drag and drop it. Okay, so now we have TinyDB1 as a component. And we can now switch back to blocks, so we can specify the logic to do this. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. So everything is starting with the with the loading of the screen. So I need to start with screen 1, and screen 1 has its own events. The event that is important to me is initialize. In other words, when this particular application starts, screen 1 is the first screen that will also be started automatically. So this is the event that you want to capture if you want to do anything at the beginning of a particular application starting. Okay, this is the first point of control that you can gain when you start an application. Is that okay? All right. Okay, so what we want to do in this case is to see whether there is a setting already for initializing or not, to see the splash screen or not. So I need to get that content. So I'm going to do something here that is going to store a global variable as, and I call it gibberish, okay, which is going to be a text constant, which is going to be something that is highly unlikely to be something that people want to actually store inside TinyDB. Okay, because later on I'm going to use exactly the same string all over the place when I want to say, okay, is this the actual content that is being stored, or is it indicating it is not stored at all? Okay. So I'm going to pick something that has numbers, digits, punctuations, and then some more digits, space, punctuation, weird, just weird combination of stuff. Okay, so the way I specify this gibberish is here, like this. You can definitely choose, some other gibberish. It's just something that is very, very unlikely to be stored in TinyDB, as in that something that's unlikely to be content of anything. Okay. Now that we have this, then I can use a conditional statement here to see whether I should load the next screen automatically or not. Okay. The conditional statement is under control. It's just basically a if then else. Okay. So I just use an if then here. And the condition that I'm checking is based on the comparison of text. So I'm going to compare, well, maybe not text. I'll do this, like this way. So what I'm comparing here is the equality, and what I'm trying to find out is whether TinyDB1 can retrieve the setting for skipping the splash screen. So I want to use TinyDB1 get value to specify the first thing that I'm comparing. The tag is going to be something that I have to determine. So what I'll do is I'm turning that into a string as well. So this is a TinyDB tag, and this one is specifically for whether to skip the splash screen or not. So skip splash. Okay. That's the name of the global variable. The string is going to be the actual name of the tag itself. So it's going to be skip splash. Okay. The reason why I turn this into a global variable is to make sure that when I refer to the tag, I refer to the tag consistently. So I don't have to retype the tag name every single time. If I have a typo, then it is not going to make a connection. So that way, this way, when I specify this tag here, I can go to variables and just use the global variable to specify the tag, which is td tinydb tag skip splash. So this way I can specify that here. Value if tag not here, I'm going to throw away the empty string here, and instead I'm going to use gibberish. So once again, go get gibberish as a global variable to specify, okay, if it's not found, it's going to return gibberish. This specifies the first component of the comparison. The second component of the comparison is just going to be gibberish itself, because I want to see if it is already stored in TinyDB or not. So here I will go to variables, get gibberish all by itself, like so. So in the end, when the comparison is returning true, that means skip splash is not stored in TinyDB, and it should not be skipping. Okay. On the other hand, if it does not equal to gibberish, then I should be skipping. So I specify the wrong comparison here, because I should be using not equal to, but there's no not equal to. There's only less than, equal to, or greater than. Well, that's not a big deal, because if you want to specify not equal to when you already have equal to, you can go to logic and just use a logical negation. So now it is not equal to, because it's specifying not equal to, not this thing equal to that thing, which is basically saying if this thing does not equal to the other thing. Are there any questions at this point? Okay. So if it is not gibberish, it means we do want to skip, and if we do want to skip, you have to go to control to start the next screen, or whatever screen you want to start next, and it is this one here. There are two options. One option is to open another screen with screen name only, and the other one is to open another screen with a specific start value. Which one you want to use depends on whether there's anything to pass on to the next screen or not. So if your splash screen also includes, let's say, login information and a few other things that you need to pass on to the next screen, then you want to use the one with a start value. On the other hand, if it is simple like this one, it's just an animation, so that people can watch the kind of entertaining animation, then there's nothing to pass on to the next screen. You can use the first option, which is the easier one. So in this case, I'm going to use the first one because it is the easier option. There's nothing for me to pass on to the next screen. But you do have to specify the name of the next screen. And those names, you cannot see it from here. Well, you do. So when you click on, the screen drop-down box, it will show you all the screens that are currently available. These are the actual names of the screens, okay? What you see on the screen itself is really just the title. So in this case, I want to start with screen main, because that's my main screen. So screen main with uppercase S and uppercase M is what I want to specify here to specify the screen name. So I go to text, pick out a empty string, and put screen name here. Oops, main. So this way, if TinyDB says, the end user wants to skip the splash screen, then when this application starts, initialize is going to get control, and it will immediately switch to the next screen. So you might still see like a fraction of a second, you might still see the main the screen one, but then it will automatically transition to the next one. Is that okay? Making any sense? Okay. Yep.
Do you have to store a value in that TinyDB?
Yes, I do, but not from this event.
Oh.
Because when people click the start button, that's my second chance to actually be able to do something.
Oh, okay.
Yep. Okay, so this is one event that I'm capturing, and then there are a few other events that I can also capture. How you want to do this is kind of up to you. I would do it with this button. Okay, when the button is clicked, then I'm going to say, okay, do we want to store something into TinyDB before we start the next screen? Okay, so we can. We know that this block needs to be duplicated. Okay, it needs to be somewhere in here. I'll just put it here first. But before we do that, we also need to make sure that we store into TinyDB whether we should skip the screen or not next time. So that means I need a conditional statement. There are several ways to do it. But I would go to a conditional statement first and basically say if the checkbox is already checked. Okay? So you can go to the checkbox and use one of its properties just to find out whether it is checked or not. And right here, okay. So this is automatically a Boolean. In other words, checkbox 1 dot checked is already either a value that is true or false. It doesn't need to be compared to true or false because by itself it is either true or false. Is that okay? So if it is already checked, then I want to store an entry into TinyDB and say, hey, from here on, don't, remember, do not show the splash screen anymore. So only in this case, I want to store something into TinyDB. So I go to TinyDB1 and say, okay, go ahead and store a value. The tag is going to be the global variable. And then the value to store, I can just make it a 1, which is a numerical constant, okay? As long as there's an entry here that is not gibberish, it's okay. Okay, you can spell out true, T-R-U-E, you can spell out yes, Y-E-S, and so on and so forth. As long as it is not the gibberish, it's going to be fine. Okay. Do we have any questions about the application at this point? Okay. All right, so do I want to go on and do more stuff now, or do I want to kind of like test this first to make sure this is working before I move on?
Do more.
Test it first, okay? So we want to test first. So to test this first, you cannot use the emulator anymore. Because remember, when you use the emulator in connection with App Inventor, it is only good for single screen applications. I have a multiple screen application at this point, so I need to use the APK approach, which is a little bit more complicated, but not by much. So what I need to do now is to start the emulator, but this time, because the emulator has no connection directly with App Inventor, I can now use the Android Studio emulators, which are more recent versions of Android as opposed to the one that is built into App Inventor. That one is really, really ancient. Is that okay so far? Okay. So we'll go ahead and start the other one. Now, I know most of you are not using Linux, but you can probably get, the Android, emulator started using its graphical user interface. So what I'll do is I'm going to show you how to use the more graphical way to start this up. I don't really have an option until I get to that part, so I will, okay, I have 2 folders with that name. I just need to find out which one is the more recent one. ls-ld. Okay, SDK Linux is the more recent one, so I'm going to go use that one. Then we go to Tools and start up Android. Android is the overall control mechanism of Android Studio. So the first thing it wants to do is to do the update, and it's failing because SSL peer, unverified peer, not authenticated. Okay. But the major components are installed, I just cannot install the updates. Okay. We go to Tools, and then we go to Manage AVDs. AVD stands for Android Virtual Device, okay, which basically are our emulators. So we go here, and we already have one that is already set up. And if I remember correctly, this one is based on the Nexus 5, which is the phone that I have. Okay. So when you're here, you can actually just click Start once you have a particular virtual device selected. So just click Start and Launch. And that should start up, a particular emulator. And is it failing? I think that's just a key. Let's close all the stuff that I don't need anymore. There we go, it's just being slow. So if you're planning to make your application multiple screen, you will have to do the same thing. Because it would be impossible to debug a multi-screen application using App Inventor itself. All right, so there we go. We do have the app, or we have the emulator, started up here. But we are not done yet because we have to go. Well, we have to go back to the command line, choose a different window here, because this time we have to start ADB. Okay, the Android device bridge. Yep. Mm-hmm. I always think DB is debugger, because that's GDB is the GNU debugger, but ADB does not stand for debugger. It stands for device bridge. So we go to the same folder, Android SDK Linux, but this one is found in Platform Tools. So this time you have to go to Platform Tools, and ADB is here. So the first thing you want to do is to do an ADB. If you do this in Windows, you don't need the // because in Windows, if you don't name which folder is providing the executable, it will default to the current folder. But in Linux, it does not do that. So you have to specify /, which is basically literally saying, in this folder, there should be a program called ADB. Okay, so in Linux, you have to do this. In Windows, you don't. So you say /ADB, and you say start server. Because ADB is server-based, you need to start the server first. And if everything is good and it says daemon started successfully, then you can check and say, okay, what devices are available for debugging at this point? Devices, okay, plural, and you will see that you can see an emulator, connected at this point. Now, if I hook up my phone and I turn on ADB, capability on my phone, then it will also show up here. Then you have to select which one you want to use for debugging, which one do you want to use when you upload something. But as long as there's only one device listed here, you don't have to specify which device because, hey, there's only one device. You don't have to be specific. Okay. All right. So now I have the command line ready to actually upload and install applications. So now we can go back to the browser. And there's one setting that might be helpful is you go to the configuration of your browser, go to preferences, and go to specify downloads. So instead of saving files always to the downloads folder, it is helpful to ask you every single time, because this is where you can overwrite an existing file. If you do not select always ask me where to save files, and it's automatically saving to the downloads folder, when you download a file that has the same name as a file that is already there, then it will start to use the parentheses and the number inside. It will automatically rename the file, which is going to be, it's not bad, it's just not very handy, okay? If you choose this option, then it will ask you, do you want to overwrite an existing file? It's actually better for us, okay? So that's why, when I do work like what I'm doing now, I always, want to make sure that the browser asks me, do you want to overwrite this file? Yes, because I do want to overwrite the file of the same name. I don't want to create a different file with a different name. So, and I think the option is taken in automatically. So now I can just close the preference screen, and now we can go to build, and just specify save APK file to my computer. If you're doing this on an actual Android device, you can select the first option and just use the QR code to download, and it's just quicker and easier. But if you're using an emulated device, this is pretty much the only way to do it. Did anyone check out all the other projects with the gallery? No, not yet. Okay. Did you find anything interesting?
Maybe a web browser.
Just using the web viewer, right?
But they also do bookmarks and stuff like that.
Oh, okay. All right, so it is defaulting the file name of the APK to the name of the project itself, which is FT scorecard or field target scorecard. So that's fine. We don't need to change that. I just press the Enter key. Okay, so now it is saved in the temp folder. I switch back into my command line. Okay, you have to do this also in Windows. You have to switch between the browser and your command line interface, which is CMD in most versions of Windows. And this time we have to use ADB again. Install -R to reinstall if it's already there, and then you specify the path to the APK file. In this case, I'm in the temp folder. When you do this in Windows, you might have to specify a longer path name because Windows has a different way of arranging the location of the files. And it's called ft scorecards.apk. Press the Enter key. It will upload, install, and should report back as successful. Okay, everything is good. So we now switch to the emulator itself. It is now an installed app. So when I click this button, I should see FD scorecard right here. For people in the back, I know it's hard to see it. I cannot move the screen up a little bit because I suppose I can. It's just that later on I have to move it back down too. So let me see if I can do it. Yep, there we go. So FD scorecard is here, and the application is started, and now I have to move it back down just so they can, well, I guess you don't have to see the entire thing. So I can click start right away, okay, so click start, and it moves on to the next screen, which is the main screen, okay. If I click the back button, it will go back to the previous one. If I click back one more time, then the application closes. Because this is the first screen of the entire application. If I go back from this screen, then the application closes. So let's double check, make sure that's the case. Okay, now the application closes. If I start again, it should go back to the splash screen because I did not check that checkbox. I have not checked it yet. So this time I'm going to check it before I start. Okay, go back twice to close the application. And I start it again, but this time because TinyDB has already remembered to skip the splash screen, this time when I start the application, the splash screen may blink for a fraction of a second, but it should not stay there the whole time. Okay, so let's double check. And it did not even show you, okay, because it was so quick, you could not even see it. Is that okay? So the feature works as expected. Any questions at this point?
So if you hit back, it will go back to the splash screen?
Yes, it would.
And then if you uncheck the box, will it then set it as unchecked again?
No, because I don't have the blocks to do it.
Okay, but you can't set the box.
I can, yep. Actually, when I go back, it does not. Oh, it just hung up. Okay, let me do it one more time. I think maybe I was just impatient. Yep, it did go back. So this time, it did not even put a check mark here because when I initialized the screen, I did not use the TinyDB entry to reflect it here. But you brought up a good point. This is the only way to reset it once you have set it. Okay. All right. So now let's go back to the code here and implement what you just said. Okay. If I want to clear that thing and I want the splash screen to show up again, how do we do it? Okay. So the way you do it is to clear the value that is already stored. So one convenient way to do it is to do it here. So you basically add an else case here, which basically means what if the checkbox is not checked? You don't store a value, you basically have to clear that value. So you go to TinyDB1, and then you clear a particular tag, which is the one that we are dealing with here. And that should do it. Okay? So that one little change here gives you the ability to clear that, not viewing the splash screen. Okay. Well, just because I said it should work, just because I think it should work, doesn't mean that it is actually working. So we'll test this feature again. So we go to build and save APK file again, and this time you will see why I configured the browser that I did, because it won't save it as a different file name. It will confirm with me, do you want to overwrite an existing file, but it will save it in the name that is, that the actual name of the file. All right, so it is trying to save the file as ftscorecard.apk, but since I already have a file in the current folder, if I click save, it will just ask me, do I want to replace it? And the intention, yes, I do want to replace it. I don't want to save it as a new file with a different name. So this time when I switch back to the command line, it's easy. Up arrow, press enter key, I'm done. Okay, in other words, even though it sounds like this is a more complicated way to debug your application, it's not. Because once you set it up, which takes a few minutes, the next few iterations for the next hour, for the next 2 hours or whatever, it's just, save the file, up arrow, press the enter key. It's not any more complicated than using App Inventor itself to control, the emulator. So now that the application is uploaded, and I switch back to the emulator, and now we can run it again. It skips because that setting is still saved. Press the back button, go back to here, This time I click start again because that's the trigger to remember to clear the entry. Start again, go back to close the entire application. This time when I start again, that particular tag should be cleared from TinyDB, and the splash screen is now redisplayed. Yeah, it will display the splash screen when I start the application again. So it is working the way that I write that it's supposed to. Are we doing okay so far with this? Okay, excellent. All right, so now that the splash screen is done, we can now move on to the main screen and implement some of the features of the main screen itself. So we go back to Designer, go to the main screen. The main screen is really kind of Spartan at this point, only has 2 buttons. I'm not going to worry about continuing a saved match yet, okay? So because I cannot really test or do anything about it until I have implemented start a new match, okay? So I'm not going to do anything about continuing a saved match at this point. So I want to look at start a new match and say, okay, what do we need to do about this? There's not a whole lot. We just need to go to another screen to get the whole thing started. So we look at the blocks, and we just say, with the first button, when it is clicked, we want to start another screen. So go to Control again, go to Open another screen, and this time the screen name is going to be New Match Config. So we want to remember New Match Config as the name of the next screen. Go. Screen New Match Config. And I'm just going to double check. Yep, okay, that looks like what it's supposed to be. Okay, and that's it. Now, this time I'm not going to use any time to check this feature because it's simple enough. If it's not working, I know exactly where the problem is. So instead, I'm going to switch to the next screen, which is New Match Config. Go back to the Designer so that we know what it looks like. So this is where we can create a new match. Now this screen does have a lot of stuff to do because we have to, when people click start match, I have to create the list that is needed in order to store everything. Okay, so this is when things start to get a little bit complicated because I also have to pass this list along to the next screen. Okay, and then the next screen has to pass information back to this one. So this is where things get a little bit more complicated. The first thing I might want to do is to change the table layout here because I only need 3 rows, so I might as well just change it to 3 rows instead of 6. So we changed it. So it just looks a little better, okay, without all the empty space. And we also want to kind of test out, how to use a date picker. So we can just go ahead and test the program as it is now. So once again, build the APK file, download it, and then install it into the emulator just to check out what we have at this point. That's not bad. If you use Android Studio, it will take a little bit of time as well to do all the compiling and whatnot.
I actually started using that yesterday. The Android the Studio. Started looking at some tutorials online. They are the most confusing tutorials I've ever seen in my life.
You can start looking, but the class won't be offered for another year.
No. I was looking at the tutorials online to basically learn about Android Studio, the basics of it. But they will not teach you basics; they'll just go into create an application.
Yep. Well, but you can see how busy the configuration screens look like with Android Studio. So that's why we are not starting with that in the first class.
Are you planning on teaching it in the fall?
Not the fall, because in the fall, this class will be offered again in the fall, so we are going to group two 362s into one 363. Because not the entire class is going to move on to 363. Some people may decide, I think I got enough, I don't want to get into 363. So, if we just move on and offer 363 in the fall, it is most likely going to be canceled because we won't have enough students. So that's why we are offering two 362 sections in 2 consecutive semesters. Then we offer one 363. Hopefully we will have enough students for the 363 at that time.
So that means that since you've already taken one this semester, you can't take it next semester for part 2 or no?
Well, I mean, you can probably sit in if you want to, if there's room.
So basically the next class in the fall will be the same class as this one?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
I just thought that maybe it's like part 1 and part 2.
Nope. Well, 363 is going to be offered in spring, so the continuation of this class is going to be spring 2017, which is probably in one of the portable buildings yet to be built. All right, so this is the actual app running. We click start, we click start new match, and this is the screen. It has no code whatsoever. I have not specified any blocks with this screen yet, but we can check out match date. Click it, and it just gives you a date picker. So this way, it is almost impossible for people to click to put in the wrong date. Okay, because now it has to be. You cannot specify the wrong date, because if you try to specify the wrong day of month, it just moves on to the next month. Okay. But by default, it is today's date, which is great. You just click OK, and you can enter the name of the shooter. Okay, so it's just me. Total number of lanes, let's say it's 12 lanes, and starting lane number is number 6. And click start match. Nothing happens because I have not associated any blocks in this particular screen, so there's nothing happening whatsoever. It's to be expected, okay? But at least I get to check the functionality of the application up to this point. Everything is as expected. I don't have any surprises. Okay? Are there any questions about this? Oh, I want to see if I can do something that's unreasonable. With lanes, which is supposed to be a number, I want to see if I can enter like WQERT. Yes, the answer is yep, I can. And that's because I did not put the limitation of using numbers only. Okay, so we can go back to this block here, go back to designer, and click on number of lanes. Look at the properties of this text box. I can now check numbers only to make sure that people cannot enter anything that is a non-number. Same thing with a starting lane. It can only be a number. Okay? Is that going to be reasonable? Can someone specify 600 as the number of lanes? Yes. Can someone specify -15 as the starting lane? Yes. So just because people can enter only numbers doesn't mean that you don't have to do any error checking, because people will still, put in the wrong thing. Now sometimes it may not be intentional. Maybe they intend to put in 15 as 15 lanes, but they mistype, the thumb is too big, okay, and they put in 156, okay. You have to check it, because otherwise the rest of the application is going to assume there are 156 lanes. By the time it gets to the 15th lane, you press and say, okay, move on to the next one. It's going to move on to lane 16, which does not exist. Okay, so you do have to kind of do a sanity check on these number of lanes and stuff like that. All right, so let's see how we can do all that, sanity check before we start a match. Okay. All right, so getting back to these two text boxes. The name thing, I'm not too concerned about. If people want to use, all the strange punctuations and whatnot as their names, hey, I'm not gonna complain about that. But number of lanes and starting lane particularly, I think we need to do some error checking before people click start match. Okay. So we'll go to the blocks and see when can we do some error checking and how do we report those errors. So we look at text box 2 and we look at the events that is associated with text box 2. There are only two. One is got focus and the other one is lost focus. So the question is, what exactly is focus?
Click in the box, then it has focus.
Exactly. When it can interact with the keyboard, then it has focus. When it loses focus, it means you click on something else and the keyboard is no longer linked to the text box, then it has lost focus. Okay? In other words, when you're dealing with a GUI program, a graphical user interface program, just about any GUI type of environment, the focus basically means, is this control element the one that you're interacting right now? Now, even with a browser, you can still have the concept of focus. So let me switch to a browser, okay, right here, and go to a page like Moodle, okay? You can use the tab key. Do you see the dotted line around skip to main content? It now has focus. If I press the enter key, it is the same thing as clicking skip to main content. If I keep pressing the tab key, it will cycle through all the other things that I can interact with. Like right now, the focus is how to set up a Gmail filter so you won't miss little messages. You can see the dotted line around it. It now has the focus. If I press the enter key, it's going to go to that page. Okay, it's the same thing with Android. I can use, I guess not the tab key, but if you click on different things, it is changing the focus. So right now, the name text box has the focus, and whatever had the focus before would generate or raise the lost focus event. Is that okay? So that seems to me is a good place to do some error checking. Before people actually click the start match, if they change focus between the text boxes, we can do some error checking and go like, hey, that doesn't seem to make sense. You might want to look at it again. Okay. All right. So let's see what we can do about error checking. I'm going to close the other tabs that I don't need, just so that I don't have too many tabs on the screen. All right. So lost focus is the one that we want to do something, do some error checking. Text box 2 is the one where it asks about the number of lanes, right? So we'll do some sanity check and go, okay, maybe this is not the value that you want to use. But before we do that, we have to go back to designer because we need one particular component to do all the complaining. So what component do you think I need to use to do all the complaining? It is on the screen right now. It's typically Notifier. Very good. Okay, so that's what a notifier is for. It serves multiple purposes, but one of the main purposes of a notifier is to basically provide feedback to the end user when there are potential issues. Okay, so we're now in text box 2, and what do we want to do? We want to check the range of the numbers, right? Okay. So in order to check anything, you need to use conditions. But to do something based on the condition, you need conditional statements or if statements. So we go to control, we pick out an if block here, and you can always add the else later, so I'm not too concerned about the else part here. And we'll just go ahead and compare the number in the text box against the range that it is supposed to have. Most matches have at least 12 lanes, but I can kind of understand like smaller and more informal matches may have 2 lanes or even 1. Okay, so I'm gonna say 1 is the minimum, and the maximum I would say 40, 50 lanes is gonna be the maximum, because otherwise it would take a long time to go through all the lanes. So I'm gonna put in 1 and 50 as the limits. So we'll go ahead and use logic. Now, in order to check whether something is in range or not, you need 2 comparisons. The first comparison against the minimum, the second comparison against the maximum. But when you have two comparisons, you have two Boolean values. To combine the two Boolean values into one single condition, you need a logical operator. In this case, do we need an AND or do we need an OR? To check something is whether out of range or not. We need an OR, very good, because we can be out of range because it's smaller than the minimum, or it can be out of range because it is larger than the maximum. So we need an OR.
So, okay, so the question is that do you actually have to set a maximum, or is it something that you recommended?
Well, if someone puts in 600 accidentally when the intention is 6, and your application says, it's okay if you specify 600, I guess this match will last a few months, but it's okay. Then the end user, when they find out the problem later on, the end user would be kind of, not happy about the whole thing, right? Because the application could have checked that, 600 is totally not reasonable as the number of lanes.
Okay, so would that be the same thing for passwords then? Because for passwords, usually they have limits. That means that, like, let's say for my application, the one where the user has to register, but I have to put in a minimum, say the minimum letter for password allows 8 and maximum, let's say 10 or 12, or?
That's up to you to decide. How painful do you want the password to be is entirely up to you. I mean, different websites have different policies. Some websites, say you cannot use punctuations. Some websites says you have to use punctuations. Some websites, say, okay, you can have passwords only up to 12 characters. Other websites says you have to have at least a minimum of 12 or 10. So it's up to you. I mean, as far as passwords are concerned, it's up to you to decide, what is the quote-unquote minimum. You can, it's entirely up to you. For applications that we do in this class, I'm not too concerned about the, minimum requirement of passwords. But when you're doing this commercially, then, passwords by itself is really a thing of the past. Because most of the time, for anything that requires really a lot of security, they will call you back with a text number that you have to enter on the website to get in. So, so that's a whole different story.
Okay, so another thing is that how would you put in that caption that they're putting now saying that I imagine not a robot? Like, can you do that on the Android emulator?
No, there are several ways to do it. The first way to remind people of the range of numbers is to put in here. You just go to hint here, and so in addition to total number of lanes, you can specify 1 to, let's say 60. Okay. All right. So let's go back to the emulator because I already have some clues here. So we go. You see that?
Oh, okay.
Now, this is too small. It won't show, 1 to 60, but you can put some text here as a hint.
No, I wasn't talking about that. Like, I was talking about that basically. Did you know how they have basically like the new captions that basically make sure that you are not a robot? The new caption where
The
you
captcha.
actually click a checkbox or type in certain numbers.
Yeah.
Can you do that on the Android emulator, or can you not? Or basically, have they not put that in yet?
It doesn't have a direct link to CAPTCHA.
Okay.
So if you want to do something like that, you have to do it yourself using your own logic and your own images.
Okay.
Yep, which is going to be a little bit painful. Okay, so getting back to here, we just want to do some simple range checking here. So as we already talked, we need an OR. So we specify a OR because there are two ways for something to be out of range. The first one is based on a math comparison of less than. So we're going to specify a less than here. The second one is a comparison based on greater than, but less than and greater than really are the same thing, so I'm going to use less than in both cases. So in the first case, if the number is less than 1, oops, wrong place to put it. There we go. So this part here has to specify the number that's in the text box. So what we can do is to directly refer to the text in the text box. We go to text box 2, grab the text in text box 2, and just put it here. It will work in this case because we have already restricted people to only be able to put in numbers. Okay? If that's not the case, it can give you a runtime error if it is not a number. So the second one is going to be about the same thing. So we replicate, not this entire thing, we just want to replicate this one. And this time we are checking for larger than the maximum. So now we specify the maximum is going to be 60. So now if the number is less than 1 or if the number is greater than 60, then we create an error message.
Shouldn't that be switched?
What?
For your second part, shouldn't the text box become first?
No. Just read it again.
Yeah, but in this case,
What does this box say?
60 is less than text box.
I don't see. Yeah. Which
So
also
if-
means text box. The text of text box 2 is greater than 60. That's out of range.
Okay, but couldn't you say the other way around? Say the text box.
Yes, I could.
But okay.
But this is the same thing.
Okay.
This one is kind of there's a consistency because I keep using the less than symbol. You can convert it into greater than and just swap these two sides. It means the same thing. Makes no difference.
Okay.
Okay. Then you can now specify how to use the notifier to generate the error message. So you go to notifier, and there are many ways to generate an error message. You can go from show alert, which is basically a text that will appear on the screen for a few seconds, to something that requires the end user to click yes, I know, and so that it won't disappear by itself. So whichever way you want to do it is kind of up to you. Do you want it to be annoying and people actually have to click the button, or do you just want it to show the alert and the user does not have to do anything? Just kind of it's just a error warning message. That's up to you. So we just specify text here, and then we specify. Okay, this is where you can get a little bit more creative. You can now, use the join feature, okay, and then refer to the text in text box 1, and then you attach the message, and then you specify and you say is not between 1 and 60. So this time your error message is more specific. You can say 600 is not between 1 and 60. 61 is not between 1 and 60. If you want this to be more specific, you can also even use the comparison itself, break apart the conditional statement. If the number is less than 1, then you make a message and go, it should be at least 1. If the number is greater than 60, then you say it should be less than or equal to 60. So you can kind of customize this whole thing, make it as fancy as you want. I'm just doing a semi fancy version here. Okay. All right. So I want to test to see whether this works or not. Okay. So I'm gonna rebuild my project to retest it. Are there any questions at this point about what I have done so far? Nope. Okay. Good. Yep. Mm-hmm.
Is there a way to check that there's no numbers or that it's only text, like alphabet?
Yes, there's a way to check. I'm just waiting for this app to run first, and then we can get back to your question. Okay, so save file, yes. Overwrite, yes. Then go back to the command line, just re-upload and reinstall the application. And then we go back to the emulator, start it again. There we go. Alright, so we'll enter a number that is 78. Click the key. Nothing happens because I have not lost focus yet. In other words, as long as it still has focus, the application is thinking, oh, maybe the end user is still making changes. There's no need to check yet at this point. As soon as I click on the next one, then it says, hey, 78 is not between 1 and 60. That works. Is that okay? All right. But you specifically want to know whether there's a way to tell whether a text box has a number or not. Is that your question?
Well, just to make sure there's only alphabets, so no exclamation marks, no anything else.
Okay, so that applies to the name. Should not have certain punctuations. Now remember, names can have apostrophe, can have dash, can have what other punctuations can names have?
Usually it's only apostrophe and dash.
Some people have a comma if they want to use last name first, the format. They can, like me, I can use Aoyang, comma and then tag. Okay, depends on the convention, because in some countries, in some regions, they like to use family name first. Okay, because I don't want to say last name first because that sounds really confusing.
Can't you use because I know in PHP you can actually do regular
Expression?
Yeah.
No, not in App Inventor. As far as I know, there's no regular expression in App Inventor. But you can do your own check. Okay, so that's a good point. Okay, so let's see what kind of error checking we can do with name. Okay, so we'll go ahead and focus on that one now. So we go to we're already in the block here, and we want to do error checking for text box 1, which is where the name is. So we say when text box 1 lost focus, we want to do some checking and complain when the name has unreasonable characters. Is that what you want to do, right? Okay. So before we do anything else, we want to check out, what possibly can we do with text. It's always good to do an inventory of available tools before we decide to implement our own. This is just a constant. This is merging two strings together. This is figuring out what is the length of a particular string in terms of number of characters. This one checks whether a string is empty or not. This one does the usual comparison. Trim is an interesting one because you can trim leading or trailing spaces. Okay, it's not helpful for what we are trying to do. This one changed everything to uppercase or lowercase. This one returns the starting index of the piece in the text. So it's basically looking for a substring within a string itself, and it comes back and say where the substring is located. Not exactly what we need to do. It can be useful if you can specify, exclamation point as a substring to search for. Okay, but that's kind of cumbersome because we have so many symbols that people are not supposed to have in a name. Contains text piece is the same thing. It just basically says, instead of telling you where it is, it just tells you whether it is there or not. Okay, it's just true, false. Splitting, okay, it gives you the option to split a text or string into two pieces. Split at spaces, okay, but this is fixed, only using spaces. Segment, it's also known as mid. You can specify the string, where to start and where to end. It will give you the chunk, according to the start and the end indexes. Replacing, obfuscate. So none of these is actually what we want, what we need to use. So we have no choice but to implement our own subroutine to make sure a name does not contain characters that it's not supposed to contain. Okay, so let's go ahead and write that subroutine so we can see how to do that. So it will be a procedure. It has a result because it has to tell us whether the string is okay or not. And I'm going to put it all the way over here. And I'll call this one is name valid. Okay? So that means if it returns true, the name is actually valid. If it returns false, the name is not valid. Okay. All right. It requires at least one input. Okay? And that input is just going to be the name that I'm validating. All right. So in terms of result, you can see this notch here. It is not a regular block. It has to be a block that returns a value. There are two ways to do it. Under variables, we have the local variable block, which is what we need, because we need a way to track all the characters in the string and do a comparison on a per character basis. So we need at least one local variable as what I call the index, and that can be initialized to 1, because 1 is the index to the first character. Inside this loop here, we will need something else. So we go to control, and this time we figure out that we need a block of a do result, which basically will do certain operations, and then the result is an expression that is either true or false in this case. Okay? All right. We need one more variable. Okay? And this new variable is just valid. In other words, we want to keep track of whether the name up to the point where we scanned it is valid or not. As soon as it is invalid, we can get out, because I don't need multiple reasons to be invalid. I just need one reason to be invalid, then we can get out. So valid is going to be a Boolean. It's going to be initialized to true, because I have this optimistic view that everything is valid until I can prove it is invalid. Okay, so these two are local variables. They cannot be used or be seen anywhere other than in this particular subroutine. Okay, so now we specify, okay, so what are we going to do? Well, it's going to be a loop of some kind, because we have to check every single character in the name for characters that it's not supposed to have. So it's going to be a loop under control, and there are several types of loops here. It's not going to be a list. Okay, so I'm not going to use for each here. I don't want it to go from a certain number to another number, because even though I could use that as from 1 to the length of the string, but that means I have no easy way out. I cannot get out when I say, hey, this character is not supposed to be in the name. I have enough reason to get out. This won't let me out. This will go through every single character. So I don't want that either. The while test is what I want. Okay? Because this way I have two reasons to stay in the loop. As long as everything is valid, okay? Because anything being invalid is one reason to get out. But I need it to be valid, and I have not hit the end of the string yet. That's how I can stay in the loop. So I need a conjunction, which means I need both things to be true to stay in the loop. So here's the end. The first one is easy, because I just need it to be still valid at this point. And then the second one is looking at index and go like, okay, index has to be less than or equal to the length of the text in order for me to stay in the loop. So it has to be less than or equal to. And this is going to be the index. And it is compared to the length of the text, which is name. So we go to text here, we go specify length of the name. There we go. So this whole thing specifies the condition. Let me scroll a little bit here. This entire thing specifies the condition to stay in the loop. As long as everything is valid up to this point, and the index is still valid at this point, I stay in the loop, because I have no reason to terminate the loop at this point. What do I do in the inside here? In the inside here, I'm going to change valid. Okay, I'm going to set valid to a particular value. The value that I set valid to is a Boolean. Okay, it's either true or false. I want the expression to be true if and only if the character that I'm interested in is a valid character in the name. Okay? But there's no easy way to do it either. Okay? There's no easy way to confirm that. So I'm going to have to use another procedure to do this. So this procedure is kind of halfway done, and then I have to create another procedure just to check whether a character is valid or not in the name. So I go to the procedure again, and I specify another procedure that also has a result. And this time it is going to be is character is name character valid. Because it's not doing it to the entire name, it is only doing to one single character in the name. It will need one parameter, which is the character to be tested to see whether it's valid or not. Otherwise, it has pretty much the same structure as the other one. Well, very similar, but not exactly the same. It's going to require its own local variable. So we'll have, there are several ways to do this. I am going to use a variable called valid chars, okay, valid characters. So this is going to be a text string that contains everything that can be used in the name. So instead of specifying the exclusion list, I'm specifying the inclusion list. And it's going to be long, well, a little bit long, because I have to spell it out. So it's going to be lowercase stuvw xyz, uppercase hijklmn opqrstuv xyz. And then we have to specify the punctuations, a dash, apostrophe, comma. Okay. Now this is by no means, a really good check of, whether a name is valid or not. But since I don't have regular expressions, it's really hard to do it. I just want to demonstrate how to just check each character to see whether it's okay or not. Okay, so these are the valid characters. Yep.
So okay, so the question here is that can you actually, like let's say that I have a regular expression made that checks name, because I have one from PHP. Now, can I put that into the string and say use this expression, or will it not work then?
It won't work. If you like PHP and PHP is not going to work. If you know how to do name validation in JavaScript, you can potentially use the web component to submit a string to a quote-unquote web page, and then get a response back from the web page, so that you can use JavaScript in the web page to do your validation.
Okay, so the question, so you can do it that way, but the question to know is that if let's say I have already made a regular expression variable, right, that is usually a string. Usually when you have regular expression, it's a quotation
App
mark.
Inventor itself has no way to understand what regular expression is.
Oh yeah, but the question was like, can I copy that string without the quotation marks and just put that into this string and use this string rather than typing everything out?
It won't, because it doesn't understand regular expression. Okay, let me just give you an example. If you specify a-z in square brackets, in regular expression, that means the range of lowercase a to lowercase z is inside the range of square bracket a to z. But it means nothing to App Inventor. To App Inventor, this literally means open square bracket a minus z close square bracket. It doesn't understand this is a range of characters. So that's why it's not going to work.
Okay.
So, if you specify dot asterisk in regular expression, it means anything, any number of anything, right? but it means literally a dot and asterisk in App Inventor. It doesn't understand regular expression.
Okay.
So it has no mechanism to match against regular expression whatsoever.
Okay, so basically the only way to do it will be valid is basically send it to a web page and have that
Yep.
valid. Okay.
Yep. So if you know how to do this in JavaScript, which you can if you don't, you can find out, right? So you can create an HTML document that has JavaScript in it and a very simple interface, with a it doesn't even need to have a user interface. It just needs to interpret the URL parameters. So you pass the name that you want to validate as a part of the parameter, and it has to come back with an answer, either yes or no or valid or not. Okay, so you can trigger the execution of the JavaScript on the web page using the web component. It doesn't get it's not a visible component, so nothing gets displayed. But this is the hook. This is the bridge where you can say, okay, for really complicated text stuff I want to do in JavaScript, do it in JavaScript. Okay? But the web component is the bridge where you can send something to process in JavaScript, get the result back, and then use the result in App Inventor and say, okay, according to the JavaScript, this name is valid or otherwise not valid. Yep.
In the properties for the text box itself, you were able to select a box that said numbers only.
Mhm.
Is there also a checkbox that says character only?
Nope. As far as I remember, there's none like that. The only other box is multi-line or not. So when you look at the properties of a checkbox, multi-line is the only other option, which basically says, do you want to be able to use the Enter key to specify multiple lines of text, which is just the line feed character, in between the lines. But using just regular text only is not an option. So that is a thing that you have to enforce yourself, either only using App Inventor code or the blocks, or you can interface with JavaScript to do regular expression processing, which I think is a better way to do it, because regular expressions are very powerful for something like this, because you can specify the first letter has to be uppercase A to Z, all the following letters can be lowercase a to z with apostrophe in between, and then it has to end with a space, and then the other name is the same way. So regular expression is really the best way to do it, but since App Inventor does not support regular expression, you can't do it. So instead of doing that, I'm doing something simpler just to illustrate that yes, you can specify your own validation logic. It's just more complicated. Now, I know we are close to the end of the lecture time, so instead of finishing up this, I'll finish it up next time. But I do want to show you, a link where you can find some help for those of you who want to use JavaScript to do some of the heavy lifting of, validation and whatnot. So you can look up, App Inventor, JavaScript, Web Component, and there should be some really interesting results here. So this one is go. Alright, so this is the instruction to do it. You can basically specify your own HTML document with JavaScript in it, and basically copy it as an asset, just the same way as you upload an image or a WAV file. You can upload an HTML document into your application. So the URL is going to specify, instead of using HTTP or HTTPS, you're going to use file : as the protocol because it's a local file. You, before packaging the app, use the production path. So this is basically just telling you that you have to use this path to refer to the name of your HTML document. Now the new web view string property is much easier to communicate with JavaScript. So here's an example to do it. Okay, I will probably put something together next time, so I can actually show you in class, how to write a very simple subroutine in JavaScript to do name validation, and then be able to use that in App Inventor to do validation. So I'll do that next time on Monday. I will show you guys how to do it, and you can pretty much kind of just copy and paste the code, and then you have your own validation logic in your own application. How many people have some experience writing code in JavaScript? So so I think most of you will be interested in the mechanism of doing it because you already know how to write code in JavaScript. It's really great because it's almost like having two ways to write programs or write code in App Inventor. You can do the blocks. You can also do it in JavaScript to do all the back end, heavy lifting. Because the blocks are really inconvenient for doing that sort of thing. JavaScript is much better, but the opposite, which is controlling the user interface, the blocks are much better for that. So, are there any questions at this point? No? Is your homework doing okay? Progressing?
It is due next Wednesday, right?
It's due next Monday.
Oh.
You have 1 week from the assignment date to do it. So you have another 5 days or so?
So just to make sure that you basically want the actual a APK file that shows you all the different screens you make on there, or
Yes.
or do you want us to write down on Excel this was screen?
Both.
Both. Okay.
So I want the screen layouts. Now they don't have to be fancy. They just need to have the basic stuff that you need to get the app running. Okay, so they don't have to look fancy at all, but you do need to capture all the screens, and then you would use a spreadsheet to basically say, okay, this thing that I need to store internally is going to be linked to this particular text box in this particular screen. So you have to make an association between the data items that you're storing that you need to maintain and the graphical user interface elements or components that you have on your screens. So you have a matrix, you put a cross where there's a link, and you don't specify anything where there's no association. Is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right. Okay, so I'm going to take a break. After the break, we'll come back, and if you have any questions, if you want to work on the homework assignment, I'll be here to answer your questions.